Hey everybody, and welcome back for a brand new episode of Out of the Fishbowl. It's me, your host BrettFish, and today we are going to jump right in because we are segueing from last week's Life to the Full Live Don't Exist episode, which if you haven't listened to yet, you really need to try and make a time for after this, or you could actually just hit pause on this right now, go and listen to that episode, because that was a solid episode of bringing the fun and vibe to your existence, and most of us need to be reminded of that from time to time. But from Live Long and Prosper, we are heading straight into a conversation about prison and killing people, and could we just not? And right up front, I'm going to give a trigger warning for violence and crimes of a sexual nature. We're not going to be diving deep into them, but we are going to be mentioning and talking about them. So just be warned about that. And the quotes that I have to start this episode off are particularly hard-hitting. We have Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars." Then there was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, "There is no justice in killing in the name of justice." And then finally, Albert Camus, who said, "Capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders." Wow. Let that one sink in for a moment. Capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders. So that's where we're going with this episode, and it's going to be a bit of a deep dive into a topic that a lot of people have quite strong opinions on. And we are also going to explore the idea of kind of punitive versus restorative when it comes to punishment and incarceration. So maybe grab yourself a coffee or even a stronger drink for this one, because we are going to get real in an episode that I have titled
Episode 4, The Death Penalty.
Now imagine when it comes to prison and the death penalty that some people have really strong opinions on those things, but many people probably don't think about them much at all. Unless it's related to you, unless there's a specific incident that comes up, a lot of you probably don't think about it. But those who do tend to have really strong feelings about them, either pro or anti. And so what I want to invite you to do as we dig into this episode is to take how you already feel about those things and see if you're able to park them on the shelf. So I'm not saying stop what you think. I'm not saying don't believe what you believe. But I'm saying if you can, just for this time, put that to the side and try and listen as neutrally as you can to the ideas that I have to share on these things. And then at the end of it, pull out the good that I've said that you want to hold on to and push away anything that I've said that you think was rubbish or too sensitive or too crazy or whatever, and take the ideas that you've heard and learned and maybe incorporate them, add them to challenge the ideas that you already had, and see if you can kind of finesse or tweak or hone the ideas that you might already have about prison and the death penalty. And if you've never thought about those things, then I want to encourage you to use this time to challenge your thinking, to have some thinking about those things and what might be, what is, what could be the reasoning behind what is, and just think about these things a little bit deeply. And here's an interesting thought, and this is a bit of a late add-in because I was 2/3 through the planning of this episode when I was driving home from a mate's house. It was Julian Taylor of the Hey Man community, when I was struck by this bizarre but I think workable thought, and stay with me here. This might be a bit out there. But what if becoming a murderer begins with killing a tiny spider? Now stop reaching for that off button. Don't think I don't see you. That is an absolutely nuts idea, right? You think I've completely lost it. How could killing a tiny spider have anything to do with becoming a murderer of people? Well, think about it like this. No one is born a murderer. That's what I believe. You might not believe that, but I really believe that nobody is born a murderer. When you're looking at a little baby that's just been born, there is no murderer in there. Now, certain factors may contribute to a person becoming a murderer, things like poverty, things like gangs, being in a gang environment, or being susceptible to being pulled into gangs because of the context of where you live, so things like location. And there could be things like genetic trauma. So scientists, doctors have discovered that trauma is something that can be passed down genetically. And so there might be certain factors in and around you that mean it's more likely that you're going to head up in that place than for other people. There might be more temptation or more pressure or things like that. But nobody is born a murderer. And then a second thought I have was that as little boys in particular, I don't know if this is true for girls, but definitely for boys, killing bugs used to be a thing. Like killing spiders or killing insects used to be a thing because we could. And as I was trying to think about this, like wonder, wrestle with it, like where did that come from? Like nobody taught us, hey, go kill this bug. Or maybe they did. Maybe when we were in a situation in the home when there was a spider, and typically I guess it would be a lady would be screaming, get the spider out of here, and then a man would come and grab his shoe and squish it on the wall, and everyone would cheer. It could be like an incident like that, or even outside there's a bug and a man just reaches a rock and crushes it. Maybe that's where it came from. But I just know as a kid there used to be this thing of killing bugs. So using a magnifying glass on ants, which is absolutely horrendous, but that's what we were taught to do. Or whether it was squishing a cockroach or killing a spider or whatever, there was this sense of killing bugs was this boy thing, being a man, this idea of because we can. And maybe there's ideas of power in there or control. Maybe it's something about independence. Maybe it's something about the media. And the movies we watched, the stories we read were about people shooting and killing and war stories, James Bond, things like that, where there was this sense of power, of hero-ness wrapped up into being able to show mastery over another thing. I'm not sure, but I think this thinking led me to the idea that there is a procession. As I said, nobody's born a killer. You don't suddenly kill someone. But there might be a time when you bully somebody, and maybe that starts with words. You call someone a mean name, and then you start calling a lot of people mean names, and at some point that becomes physical. You start pushing people and you start fighting people and stuff like that, and at some point bullying becomes a more intense form of hurting, and at some point killing happens. And maybe the first time it's an accident, maybe the first time you pushed into something because there's a gang situation and it's part of your initiation, or maybe you're in prison and it's part of staying alive or whatever. But the sense of a procession that happens, that one thing becomes another thing, and at some point it leads to you killing somebody. Killing someone is never that first step. It's not that first moment. It's something that is at the end of a large number of moments. And so the other thing that I've been thinking about is this: what if we gathered, we harnessed a reversed mindset? What if I could go out of my way to preserve life in any form? And this kind of thinking hit me when I was in the States, in America, for 3 years. And I know that we were in contact with a lot of people that lived life differently, that thought differently, that challenged our thinking. And so this probably came from a number of different people that really held up life, and not just life of people, but life of insects and nature, and this idea of why go out of your way to kill something or destroy something or break something just because you can, just because it's there. And so this idea of going out of your way to preserve life in any form. And so how I've found that kind of manifests or works itself out in my life is that if there's a spider in my house, I will not kill it. I will do my best to maybe gently take it outside, or if it's a spider in my house, these days I leave them to combat the mosquitoes. But it might be a spider that somebody else has said, please get that out of here because I'm scared of it, and then I'll do my best to grab a container and put the spider in the container and safely let it go outside. Whereas when I was younger, I would have just grabbed a shoe and smooshed it or something like that. And so there's been a definite change in me of this idea of preserving life when I can. And this doesn't, let me disclaim this right now, this doesn't cover everything. Mosquitoes, this rule does not apply to. There's no context where I have gone out of my way to save a mosquito. In fact, every single day or night at my house, I'm killing mosquitoes because they are coming for me. And so for some reason, in my head, it's okay to kill mosquitoes, but preserve all other kinds of life. And ants are something else that I kill. I don't go out of my way anymore to kill ants. But if there are ants in my house that are kind of taking over or destroying food or getting in the way, then there's a certain limit or a certain line where I will add things into the system to kill the ants. And another one that's maybe a little bit strange and weird is cockroaches. I think a lot of people are okay with killing cockroaches. I tend to try and preserve the life of cockroaches. I had one last night that I discovered in my house. There's this new breed of flying cockroaches happening in Cape Town, and so I got a Tupperware and I managed to capture it in the Tupperware, and typically I release them over the wall into the neighbor's property. No, I released it over the back wall into the street and gave it another chance. And so it's this idea of, if I don't have to kill something, let me go out of my way a little bit. Let me do what I can to preserve life. Even with nature, with flowers, with plants, things like that. If there's a way to avoid killing something, then let me not kill it. And that feels like quite an easy thing. And it's a place in my life that I wouldn't say I've got pride in, but I'm really grateful that I arrived at that place. And I can't even remember the journey that took me there, but I think I saw other people going out of their way not to kill, not to destroy, and I thought that's a great way to live. What if we reversed the mindset and went out of our way to preserve life in any form? And the other thing which I've kind of spoken about in terms of the procession is that I think it's a steady progression of this idea that if this is okay, then that is okay. And so if I'm okay killing a small spider, then I can be okay killing a big spider. And then if I'm okay killing this, then maybe I can kill that. And at some stage, maybe I elevate it to birds or animals, and I don't know how that kind of moves along and gets me to the point of killing a person is okay. But I do think that it's a gradual slide. It's a slide, unless there's a kind of extreme situation where maybe I'm in a gang or I'm in a war zone, or there's something external that is heightening what feels like a need or a necessity to kill or something like that. I imagine generally it's a gradual slide of thinking, well, that's okay. Oh, I got away with that. Oh, I've already done that. I might as well do that. And so this gradual, slow progression. And so let's take a look and have a think about the death penalty. So let's go right there, and then we can slowly zoom out to a place of talking about jail and punishment and the notion and practice of rehabilitation or possibly transformation. So the death penalty, where does your thinking land on that? Is it something you've actually directly given some time and attention to? And if not, maybe take a moment now. Just spend some time thinking about the death penalty. Are you for or against the death penalty? Do you think it's okay that we kill people? Do you think we shouldn't be killing people? And if you've reached a point where you think that the death penalty is okay, it's a good part of society, then who dies? Do murderers die? Do rapists die? How about people that throw cigarettes out of car windows that really make me so super angry? Like, who gets to determine those people die and those people don't die? Because once you've decided that it's okay to kill people, that's a question you have to answer. And somebody or some bodies are making decisions on who dies. Who is it okay to kill? And then the question is, who gets to decide? As we've lived through this pandemic, and in many ways we've watched government be completely inept and corrupt in many ways, do we sit and go, those are the people I want deciding on who dies because they're going to make a good decision? In South Africa, would we want the people that run Eskom, our electricity company, would we want them to decide who gets to die? What about our church leaders? There's some of those that I really would not want to give the power of life and death to. So who gets to decide becomes such an important question. And then I think in my conversations with people that some people are against the death penalty because mistakes are made. So wrong people have been killed. And that's been proved. DNA has helped us prove that people have been incarcerated for 30, 40, 50 years. Death sentence, death row, that's just kind of been hanging or waiting. And DNA has come along and proved that they were not the person. They were wrongfully convicted. And in many cases, people that were wrongfully convicted were actually killed. And so that for a lot of people is the reason why they're against the death penalty, because sometimes we get it wrong. And so if that is your only reasoning, your only hesitation, then what if it was guaranteed that you had the right person? Does that change your answer? So if we could guarantee that only the people that we thought it was okay to kill were the people getting killed, would that change your thinking on this topic? And then another lens to hold, which I think is super important, and this one might be worth wrestling with a bit longer. I really hope a lot of these questions are going to have you wrestling long after this podcast is finished. And I really hope that you'll take it to the dinner table, that you'll talk this through with your kids, that you'll talk this through with your neighbors, people you're playing sport with. What are your opinions on the death penalty? What do you think about prison? I'd love to hear feedback on that. So when you go out and have reflections of your own and thoughts, but conversations with other people, come back and share. Come back on Twitter, on Facebook, to me in person and say, here's some of the stuff I've been thinking about. I'd love to hear it. But the lens or context we need to look at is this idea of their bad guys versus our bad guys. So if I had to ask you, who are the bad guys? Then you might have an idea of who those people are. But if I was to ask people living in Afghanistan or people living in Iran, who are the bad guys, then I wonder if their answer might be different. And so when we've seen those conflicts between America and different nations, those of us that grew up in the West, watching American movies, American lifestyle, all that kind of thing, might typically go to a place. And I know a lot of us have been questioning that and being critical on our thinking of that, but many people still have that mindset of, oh, America are the good people, therefore everyone else is the bad people. And yet when America is sending a plane in to bomb and it hits a hospital or it hits a school and civilians are killed, how do you think the people in those communities are sitting with this notion of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And so I really like the idea of this, like framing it as our bad guys versus their bad guys, and realizing that the way we view a story, our reflection, our background, our community might determine for us who the bad guys are. And our bad guys might be someone else's son. It might be someone else's brother. It might be someone else's parents. It might be somebody that really is beneficial in their community in ways that we just don't know about. And we've just developed a mindset of those are the bad guys. So again, I don't have an answer on that, but I do think we need to reflect on who gets to determine the good guys versus the bad guys. And then the other question that comes up is that many people would say that the death penalty is a deterrent. And I believe various studies have shown that it isn't, but there are also a few countries where you can point to and go, well, they've got the death penalty, and look at how amazing their lack of crime is, or whatever. I think of places like Singapore and other places. But that is a much deeper conversation, and I can't really go into all of that now because it's complicated, and you've got to look at the country itself. You've got to look at levels of poverty and overpopulation and all those kind of things. It's like you can never compare. When we talk about prisons later, we're going to talk about Norway. But if you think about that in comparison to South Africa, we can't do a direct comparison because the countries are so different. So there's so many factors that we need to remember to take into account when we're talking about these things. And so just as we wrestle with that idea, is the death penalty a deterrent? Again, a question, what if it is? What if we could prove that it is, that there would be 20% less murders if we have the death penalty? Would that be an okay price to pay? So if we knew that if we killed people for murder, there would be 20% less murders. And so this feels like a very Jack Bauer 24 kind of conversation, kind of dilemma where 100 people are going to die or 50 people are going to die. And one of those scenarios has to happen. Which one do you choose? And so we might think of it as a lesser than two evils kind of idea. But at the same time, we've got to be thinking, is it okay to kill 50 people so that 100 people don't die? And maybe the kind of questions we should be asking when we come to these either or scenarios is there a third way? Is there a scenario where we don't have to kill 50 or 100 people? And I don't know that there always is. But I do know that whoever has to make the decisions in those times, that those are very, very difficult and complicated and complex decisions. And that can be easy for us sitting far, I think most of us are probably far removed from decisions that end up in people's deaths. And so for us to be critical of those, for us to just come up with easy judgments on them, I realize is a lot easier than if you're in those places, if you're in the military, if you're in the police, and those are things that you're looking at that could be life or death decisions that you have to make in the moment every day. And so I'm not saying this stuff is easy, but I am saying this stuff requires a lot more attention than maybe we give it sometimes. And for me, a voice and a person that I've greatly admired in this area is a man named Shane Claiborne. We stayed with him for 18 months in Philadelphia in the States. And Shane and I have very different opinions on a whole lot of things. But when it comes to the death penalty, he is somebody that has done, I feel, from what I've seen, so much in terms of trying to save the lives of people that are on death row and trying to change the laws that allow for people in America to be killed by the government. And the line that Shane spoke that really influenced me deeply was this: the idea of killing people to send the message that killing people is wrong. And I think that line probably shaped my thinking on death penalty. I don't know that I grew up thinking it was okay, but I definitely know that after I wrestled with that line, I ended up thinking it's not okay. This idea that if somebody murders someone else, we kill them to prove that killing people is wrong. That, as a concept, is just so, or feels to me, so completely messed up. And if we continue on this idea of death penalty, if we come to a place where we think, okay, the death penalty is okay, it's right, it's just, who kills them? Would you take the responsibility? And that has to be a big question, because again, it's so easy for me to go, death penalty is right, if some unnamed, unknown doctor in some room somewhere is filling the syringe, or if somebody's pushing the button, or somebody's yanking the chain, or whatever it is. I don't think you yank chains to kill people. But you get what I'm saying. Like if I had to make that decision, yes, the death penalty is right, and I had to go and enact the death penalty on someone else, how does that change my opinion of the death penalty? And is that enough for me to change it when somebody else is doing the killing? If we think about, I think it was medieval times when you had hooded executioners with the axe. And I think that's significant that they had hoods on so that you don't know who's doing the killing. Because that job, that profession, that I don't know what it was so hectic. You wouldn't want people knowing that you were the executioner. It's not something you'd put in your bio. It's not something that you'd want in your CV. Kills people. You'd want doctor, maybe. Doctor in a prison. Person in government, whatever it is. General. You wouldn't want job title or kind of activities. I kill people. I make the decisions that lead to people being killed. I think most of us would not want that. And so I think that's significant. If we are okay with the death penalty, who are we saying should be the ones killing them? And are we prepared to do that ourselves? I certainly am not. And then the last question on this, I think, is what does it take for us to become the very thing that we're against? And that's a question that I think we should reflect on as we are wrestling with this stuff, and with a lot of the stuff. So not just this week, but other things we talk about, social media, things like that. How much movement do we have to make when we stand and look in the mirror and we go, sure? And I think that Shane Claiborne quote kind of takes us there, the idea of killing people to send the message that killing people is wrong. When do I look in the mirror and go, wow, I am the killer? I am the one that gave thumbs up to this killing. I am the one that said killing that person is a just and good thing. What does it take for us to become the very thing we are against? That is something that should help frame this. It should help us reflect on this. It should help us to reach conclusions on why we think this is or isn't okay. Now, you know, or many of you that have listened to this show will know that I'm a Jesus guy. So whether or not you believe in or follow Jesus, you may be interested to hear my thoughts on his thoughts on this. And so I'd ask you to just listen to this. And let me give this as a disclaimer that many Christians believe in the death penalty and somehow think it is justified. And I say somehow because I absolutely don't. In case that hasn't become clear to you so far, I totally do not agree that the death penalty is a good idea. So let's look at the things we do know about Jesus. We know that Jesus interrupted a killing that he was invited to be part of. And so there's the story of a woman who was brought in front of him for committing adultery, and apparently the law of the time said that she should be stoned to death. And so the people asked Jesus, what should we do to her? And so it seemed to be backed up or called for by his religious tradition. And yet Jesus responds in a very significant and very reflective way, where he looks at the crowd and he says, okay, kill her, go ahead, kill her. But he who is without sin, throw the first stone. And so he flipped the thing on its head, in a sense, like saying, yeah, you can kill her, but saying, no, you can't. If anyone here is sinless, if anyone here is blameless, then you can do this thing. And that looks at the question, who gets to do the killing? And what we read is that people slowly, from the oldest to the youngest, started putting down their rocks as they heard the words of Jesus, as those words sunk in. The one who is without sin can throw the first stone. And it's significant, I think, that the older guys got it first. It's like, oh yeah, I get it. And they walk away one by one. And left behind is Jesus, the only one who, if we believe the stories, is without sin. And so the only one qualified to kill this lady. And he looks at her and his response is, has anyone else condemned you? No, then I do not condemn you either. But he finishes it with this. He says, go and sin no more. And so there is a redemptive call to change or to live differently. And I think that is significant, that Jesus doesn't just pardon her. He doesn't just excuse her. He doesn't even really focus on the crime, but he says, if you did this thing wrong, stop doing that thing. Be better. Live differently. And so much goes on in that scene. Jesus interrupts a public execution that the scriptures seem to indicate was the way to go, and he showed the crowds there a different way. The second thing about Jesus is we know his attitude towards those who murdered or killed him. So Jesus is tried and he is found guilty. There are false witnesses that come and speak against him, and he's handed over to the crowds even though it's obvious that he's innocent. And we have a trial where the wrong verdict is produced, which talks to the stuff we spoke about earlier, and Jesus is sentenced to death. And one of the very last things that Jesus says, hanging from the cross, which is one of the most excruciating ways to die, a method of execution that was designed to be painful, to really make the enemies of Rome suffer as much as possible. Jesus, in that space of absolute suffering, looks out and speaks these words, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Jesus speaks forgiveness. Jesus cancels this idea of they murdered me, now go and murder them, which is actually eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, something that could be found in the scriptures at the time. Forgive them, for they don't know what they do. So we see Jesus's attitude towards those who killed or murdered him. Forgive them. Let the killing end over here. And then we also know that Jesus commanded us to love and forgive and pray for and bless our enemies. And so that was the posture that Jesus called his followers to, his disciples to, when it came to enemies. He said, love them. He said, pray for them. Look after them. Bless them. And the idea was to try and interrupt this animosity. Don't give them a reason. Don't give them further reason to be enemies. Take away any kind of retaliation that makes them want to retaliate more. And so those are just three things, but that is largely why I land where I land in terms of the death penalty. But I think an even deeper or more specific part of it for me is that I believe quite deeply that no one is beyond redemption. Now that's a faith-inspired belief for absolute sure. But it's also a humanity belief. No one is born a serial killer or a rapist. And so if that stuff can be learned, it can be unlearned. But it's also a me belief. Because I sit and I ask the question, am I dispensable? Could I do something so bad as to not be given another chance? And I think most of us, if not all of us, have a bit of a built-in voice that whispers to us, I could never be that bad. I could never be that evil. I could never be that undeserving. And so it gives us the possibility of allowing death penalty for other people because we have this assumed idea that I will never be in that place. And in the first episode of this season of Out of the Fishbowl, we looked at the story of what's the worst thing you've ever done. So find it and take a listen to it if you missed it. But that thing, the worst thing that you ever did, and I mentioned one or two stories from my life, but there are other stories that I didn't mention. That thing, however bad it was or wasn't, compared to other people's bad, well, I look at a few of my own stories of hurting people, and I have to ask, who was that guy? And it's important that I acknowledge that guy was very definitely me. It's not the person I set out to be. It's not the person I think I am or I'm trying to be or want to be. It's not the DNA of the heart of who I see myself as. Somebody who tries to love, who tries to be kind, who tries to bring justice, all of those things. But in that moment when I did the very worst thing that I could do, that person was definitely me. And if I could end up there, then where else might I end up? If I could end up in that place where I thought, that's not me, that's not who I am, and it was who I was, it was who I am in that moment, then where else might I end up? And I mean, there's a whole bunch of things I like to think I could never do or would never do that society deems worthy of death. But even with the depths that I do descend to, I want to always believe that there's a way back for me. And so I have to offer that to others. No person is beyond redemption. But there must be consequences, right? And that's this whole idea of the name of this episode, the depth penalty. What is a suitable cost that needs to be paid for ending up at that depth of depravity or evil or violence? What is a suitable cost or consequence for that to receive? And that's the problem we see in our country, South Africa, at the moment, right? No consequences or few consequences, or very little consequence for those abusing power, or for those with money or connections. But plenty of consequence if you're poor or homeless or from another African country, right? One of my favorite Jack Handey quotes goes like this: maybe in order to understand mankind, we have to look at the word itself. Basically, it's made up of two separate words, mank and eind. What do these words mean? It's a mystery, and that's why so is mankind. Now, I love the misdirection of breaking a word up into two non-words, but that quote got me thinking about this idea of consequences. And if you break that up into two words, you get con and sequences. And if you think about it, if you have money, if you have power, if you have connection, there's often a sequence of cons that will lead to you getting out of jail or being consequence free. Con sequences if you have money, power, connection. If you don't have those things, then there are actual consequences. It might be a fine, it might be prison, it might be inhumane living conditions, it might be a lack of opportunities. So it is worth considering that even as we wrestle with this idea of the death penalty, we're going to look at prison in a bit, that certain things affect. Justice is not neutral. That often money, power, and connection have ways in which they affect justice or the look of justice. And in a bit of a roundabout way, this all brings us to the other part of the conversation, which looks at the idea of prison and punishment. And the question I want to wrestle with and continue grappling with once this episode is done is this idea about whether it should be punitive in terms of punishment or restorative in terms of rehabilitation or redemption. So maybe as we start talking about this, a story might be helpful. I am 47 years old, and if I'm remembering this correctly, I've been to prison 3 times. Wait, I should probably say that better. I have been into a prison 3 times for the purposes of visiting. That's a little better. So the first time was when I was on Wild Team in 1994. It was a music and drama team, and it was in Joburg somewhere. We went into a prison to do some singing and dramas, I think, for the prisoners. We didn't have a lot of interaction with them. The second time was in Polesmore, and again I went in with a ministry team that were doing some soccer vibes with the younger prisoners, and I was there for a session. I got to see what a cell in Polesmore looked like, and the absolutely inhumane conditions of something like 30 people living in this room, and when they were all standing there they kind of fit, and I don't know how things changed when they needed to not be standing. It just was people packed into a cage. It was absolutely awful. And then the third time was when I was in Philadelphia in the USA, when I visited my friend, my neighbor, and my Domino's partner, Mike. And that really was kind of like a movie's prison scenario. I went in with his wife to visit him, and it was the whole vibe of sitting at the table, and they would be at the other side of the table, and various kind of prisoner and family interactions were happening around the room, and it was very surreal. It felt straight out of the movies. And I'm currently writing snail mail letters to somebody who is in a prison in Cape Town. Oh wait, 4 times. I just remembered that when I was in Stellenbosch, I visited one of the youth guys there. And that wasn't prison so much as a holding cell before he got sent off to prison. So in 47 years, I've been into a prison 4 different times. I don't know what your situation is in that. But back to the letters. They are not just letters that I'm writing to someone in prison. They are to a mate of mine who was a youth pastor and a police reservist. But then he was caught for something that he very definitely did. And he is busy serving his time. And I think he's been there for over 2 years. And I've only just sent off letter number 2. So I have not been all that great. And I'm working at hopefully being better in terms of being in contact. And hopefully in the new year, I'm going to get a chance to actually go in and visit him and connect with him. But I think that story is relevant because it illustrates the fact that I am somewhat personally invested here. And I imagine that most people don't ever really end up in prisons unless somebody they know ends up in one. So I imagine if you don't know someone in prison, you've probably never been to prison, unless you are part of a ministry team or something like that, an outside NGO that might go in to do something with prisoners. But I think for most people, it's usually because there's a connection with somebody that goes inside. And maybe you don't think a lot about prisons either, unless for some reason it comes up, maybe on the news or in a story that you hear. But I'd really like to ask you to think about them now with me for a little bit. And a really helpful book to read on this, and especially if you are American, because it's from an American context, but it was just a super helpful, informative book. And I think for anyone to read to start to understand some of the politics and economy of prisons. And this book is by a woman named Michelle Alexander, and it's called The New Jim Crow. It was super eye-opening for me in terms of understanding how much goes on behind the scenes and how in America in particular, but I think in many other countries that prisons have become a business and that there is a lot invested in keeping people in prisons and so on, which is a conversation for another day. But when most of us think about prison, I imagine it's usually with a punitive punishment mindset. Those people must pay for what they did. And that makes a lot of sense. But it typically has in mind the person or group or society that was wronged and not the person who committed the crime. So we're thinking from the perspective of those on the outside, those who have been hurt by the thing. And in doing this, we also tend to attack or devalue the identity or humanity of the person who committed the crime. So a person who steals becomes a thief. A person who rapes becomes a rapist. And a person who kills someone is now a murderer. They're not a person who killed someone. They are a murderer. They are a rapist. They are a thief. The person becomes, or the identity is the thing that they did. And I really think that this is quite important. And I imagine this particular concept might be really challenging for some of you that are listening, and some of you are going to think strongly differently to me on this one, because I think when you start to separate the person from the crime, there can be this idea that you're not holding them responsible, you're not holding them accountable, and I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting absolute accountability, absolute consequence, but just looking at the way in which we bring those things about. But I do think if we focus purely on the action and the crime, that it is maybe easier to discard people. Especially given the extremely violent nature of both murder and rape in South Africa, where I live. And again, let me not rush forward on that crime in South Africa is particularly violent, and we see things or we hear things in the newspapers that absolutely make us sick to our very core. How can something like that happen to like a baby or a 2-year-old or to an old person? There is absolutely violent crime which is sickening and disgusting, and that is the reality of some of life in South Africa. And so when I'm asking us to wrestle with these things, I'm not asking us to let go of the absolute disgust that is connected to those actions and those crimes. I'm just asking us to hold that with the humanity of the people involved. And so once we start to take into account the possible journey between innocent baby and person committing the atrocious act, then I'm hoping that we can dig a little deeper into our shared humanity and arrive at a very different place from one in which we willingly and I would say in many cases gleefully, discard human beings. And in fact, wherever you lean on this issue, can I ask that you join me for a few moments to consider that particular notion? We discard human beings. Does that change anything for you? We discard human beings. Because I think as much as there had to be a journey in that other person going from innocent baby to this person committing a murder or raping or violent crime or whatever it is, as much as there was a journey in that person, there also had to be some kind of movement in us if we think like that, right? We don't start out in life thinking it's okay for anyone to die. And so something happens between us as a child and this moment when we are grown up adult that says it is okay for that person to be discarded. It is okay for that person to die. Something happens in that journey of life. And I think a large part of it is probably TV and movies and games, because they play a huge factor in desensitizing us. And in South Africa, perhaps also the extreme prevalence of it. There's so much of it. It's always happening. The stories don't shock us anymore. They don't surprise us anymore because we have stuff happening every single day, and it's always in the news, and it's always in the papers, and it's always stories that we're hearing on social media. And so maybe that after a while starts to desensitize us. And I remember catching myself, and this happened like maybe 20 years ago, but I remember hearing a news story or a report in which this event happened, and I heard myself saying or thinking the words, only 11 people died. Phew, only 11 people died. How messed up does your lived experience have to be to find you prefacing 11 people died with the word only? And I think in this particular case, it was a bus accident and 11 people died. And it was like, sure, only 11 people died, because I'm used to something happening and 30 people die or 50 people or 100. Only 11 people died. That is messed up. I am messed up when I'm thinking like that. And that is the desensitization that has happened. And I do believe that movies and books and games play an effect. If we can watch murder after murder on our screens day in, day out, that has to affect us somehow. And we love to think, oh, well, it doesn't affect me, but I know that it's affected me. And I need to find ways of resensitizing myself. And we are not going to solve this here. I don't think that's the point. But I do want to invite anyone listening who's pro-death penalty to make sure that you've thought about it long and hard. The purpose of this podcast isn't even to have everyone thinking the same as me afterwards. I think I'm anti-death penalty and I think prisons should be like this or whatever. But the main purpose of this, I want you to think. I want you to explore your ideas. I want you to interrogate your ideas. And if you land somewhere different, that's great. If you strengthen your ideas because of what you've heard with this, then that might be great as well. But just be thinking about these things. Just be considering them. Just be looking at other ways of thinking than you've always had. Be exploring why you think the way you think. Who passed those ideas on to you, or where were those ideas informed? Where did they come from? Because when deciding that a human being deserves to die, that is one that you really want to get right. Surely. Now, before I end this episode, I would also love us to be at least considering the notion, when it comes to prison, of this difference between punitive versus rehabilitationary. Punitive, a focus on punishment, negative consequences, which generally lead to an increase in negative behavior, or rehabilitation, a focus on helping the person change for the better, positive reinforcement with the hope of longer-term positive results. And so it feels like a fear-based versus a reward and transformation-based way of looking at how we do prison. And let's look at this briefly through the lens of two prisons who have been trying to do this differently. So I remember a number of years ago reading about a prison that was somewhere in South America where, I think this was when I was in the States actually, where there were no bars on the prison cells and the prisoners got to have some sense of freedom around the prisons. And so I did a Google search and I found two prisons that have very different ways of doing prison. And I'm not necessarily endorsing everything about these two ways because they are very much criticized in different ways, and I think we should look at them critically and say what is good, what is bad, but also maybe we can use them to reflect our thinking on this idea that another way is possible. And so the two that I found out come basically from two articles I read on them. So I'm going to be reading a lot of the paragraphs from the article just to share some of the ideas. And this first article was in The Guardian, and it's about a men's prison in Itaúna, which is in southeast Brazil. The headline reads, "In a country where jails are seen as ticking time bombs, a system of self-rule among inmates has proved a striking success." Renato da Silva Jr. harbors ambitions of becoming a lawyer. There's just one obstacle. He is a quarter of the way through serving a 20-year jail sentence for murder. "My dreams are bigger than my mistakes," says Da Silva, a slightly built man with a broad smile. "I am doing everything to get out of here as soon as I can." Da Silva, 28, an inmate at the men's prison in Itaúna, a town in Minas Gerais, southeast Brazil, is chipping away at his sentence and has already reduced it by 2 years through work and study at the Association for Protection and Assistance to Convicts, which is APAC, so it's an APAC prison. Here, inmates wear their own clothes, prepare their own food, and are even in charge of security. At an APAC jail, there are no guards or weapons, and inmates literally hold the keys. Brazil has the world's 4th largest prison population, but a visit to the APAC men's and women's prisons in Itaúna subverts all expectations about the penal system in Brazil, where overcrowding, squalor, and gang rivalry cause deadly riots. And one of the key differences is that APAC inmates are addressed by name rather than number, which can maybe seem like a small thing, but it's such a humanizing thing to be called by your name and such a dehumanizing thing to be referred to as a number. And it says here, one reason inmates uphold the strict routine of work and study required by APAC, under which no one is permitted to stay in their cells unless they are sick or being punished, is that an escape attempt would return them to the mainstream system which all inmates have experienced before. So there's this sense of they've all known what real prison is like. There's this opportunity in the special prison where things are very relaxed, where they're treated as human, and so that seems to be the thing that compels them to continue to do the study and work that is available to them. Founded in 1972 by a group of Catholics to provide a humanizing alternative to mainstream prisons, the system has now reached 49 jails in Brazil and has branches in Costa Rica, Chile, and Ecuador. They seek to rehabilitate inmates who must show remorse. They are cheaper to run, have lower rates of recidivism, and recidivism is repeat offense, people that are jailed for a second or third time, and are designed to benefit the wider community. Ana Paula Pellegrino of the Igarape Institute think tank in Rio de Janeiro says this: "By committing a crime, prisoners break the social pact. An APAC prison restores this by allowing inmates to work for the community. Some prisoners might go out to sweep the streets, for example, which gives them a sense of responsibility and belonging." In the closed area, the APAC philosophy is written on the wall with slogans including "The man enters, the crime stays outside." Prisoners convicted of the most heinous crimes are here, yet it feels calm and safe. In the woodwork room, the mood feels darker. "This area is for the new arrivals," says Jacopo Sabbiatelio, Vice President of AVSI Brazil. "They have broken something with their hands, so now must make something good with their hands." APACs are an effective way to respect human rights within Brazil's penitential system, says Judge Paulo Antonio da Carvalho. "I am in no doubt that prisoners' individuality and fundamental rights, as guaranteed by the Constitution, are respected. A prisoner should only lose his liberty, but keep his fundamental rights." So that is the men's prison in Itaúna, southeast Brazil. And then there's the second prison. On Bastøy Prison Island in Norway, the prisoners, some of whom are murderers and rapists, live in conditions that critics brand cushy and luxurious. Yet it has by far the lowest reoffending rate in Europe. For the person writing this article, the first surprise for them was that the ferry operative revealed that they were a serving prisoner doing 14 years for drug smuggling. Before he transferred to Bastøy, Petter was in a high security prison for nearly 8 years. "Here they give us trust and responsibility," he says. "They treat us like grown-ups." Despite the seriousness of their crimes, however, I found that the loss of liberty was all the punishment they suffered. Cells had televisions, computers, integral showers, and sanitation. Some prisoners were segregated for various reasons, but as the majority served their time, they were offered education, training, and skill-building programs. Instead of wings and landings, they lived in small pod communities within the prison, limiting the spread of the corrosive criminal prison subculture that dominates traditionally designed prisons. The teacher explained that all prisons in Norway worked on the same principle, which he believed was the reason the country had, at less than 30%, the lowest reoffending figures in Europe and less than half the rate of the UK. When asked about life on the island, Petter responds, "You'll see, it's like living in a village, a community. Everyone has to work, but we have free time so we can do some fishing, or in summer we can swim off the beach. We know we are prisoners, but here we feel like people." It always seemed to me that the real prison scandal was the horrendous rate of reoffending among released prisoners. In 2007, 14 prisons in England and Wales had reconviction rates of more than 70%. At an average cost of £40,000 a year for each prisoner, this amounts to a huge investment in failure and a total lack of consideration for potential future victims of released prisoners. That's the reason I'm keen to have a look at what has been hailed as the world's first human ecological prison. There are 70 members of staff on the 2.6 square meter island during the day, 35 of whom are uniformed guards. Their main job is to count the prisoners, first thing in the morning, twice during the day at their workplaces, once at a specific assembly point at 5 p.m. and finally at 11 p.m. when they are confined to their respective houses. Only 4 guards remained on the island after 4 p.m. The small, brightly painted wooden bungalows dotted around the wintry landscape are the houses for the prisoners. They accommodate up to 6 people. Every man has his own room and they share kitchen and other facilities. The idea is they get used to living as they will live when they are released. Only 1 meal a day is provided in the dining hall, and the men earn the equivalent of £6 a day and are given a food allowance each month of around £70 with which to buy provisions for their self-prepared breakfasts and evening meals from the island's well-stocked mini supermarket. I can see why some people might think such conditions controversial. The common understanding of prison is that it's a place of deprivation and penance rather than domestic comfort. Prisoners in Norway can apply for a transfer to Bastøy when they have up to 5 years left of their sentence to serve. Every type of offender, including men convicted of murder or rape, may be accepted, so long as they fit the criteria, the main one being a determination to live a crime-free life on release. In terms of work, they have a farm where they tend sheep, cows, and chickens, or grow fruit and vegetables. They can work in the laundry or the stables, in the bicycle repair shop, on ground maintenance, or in the timber workshop. There's a group of red phone boxes from where prisoners can call family or friends. A large building to our left is where weekly visits take place, in private family rooms where conjugal visits are allowed. As the security officer signed me in, he said, "You know, on this island, I feel safer than when I walk on the streets in Oslo." In closed prisons, we keep them locked up for some years and then let them back out, not having had any real responsibility for working or cooking. In the law, being sent to prison has nothing to do with putting you in a terrible prison to make you suffer. The punishment is that you lose your freedom. If we treat people like animals when they are in prison, they are likely to behave like animals. Here we pay attention to you as human beings. The reoffending rate for those released from Bastøy speaks for itself. At just 16%, 16%, it is the lowest in Europe. So I don't know what you think about those. One of those is a prison in Brazil, one is in Norway, 2 places where they are doing prison differently. In both of them, they spoke about treating prisoners as human beings, seeing the humanity in the person, seeing the potential for rehabilitation. And both prisons had a much lower level of recidivism. 16% at that last one. So there you have it, some thoughts on prison and the death penalty. And I really hope that wherever you were as you came into this episode, whatever your thoughts were on these things, that there's been some stuff to really make you reflect and consider. And my deep desire is that you will continue these conversations elsewhere. And like I said, I'd love, if you have children, I'd love for you to sit and chat to kids about these things. I don't think kids are too young to be thinking about these ideas. I'd love for you to be talking to your friends and neighbors about them, and just considering how we treat people. Just this idea of discarding people is the thing that maybe will stick with you as you leave here. And I'm going to end us off just going back to look at those first 3 quotes we looked at, because those were super hard hitting. But now you're going to be hearing them in the context of my thoughts around prison and death penalty. So first up, Albert Camus: capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders. Archbishop Desmond Tutu: there is no justice in killing in the name of justice. And Martin Luther King Jr.: returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. We do not need more darkness in the world. We need to find new ways of bringing light, and especially bringing light to the people and the places where it seems to have gone out. And so even if you leave here just with that question, that idea of how can I see the humanity in people who have seemed to have lost it, or in people that I or others have discarded or dismissed, how can I find ways of reimagining the humanity of people that are locked away, of people that have done disgusting, horrible, violent things? I think if we can start asking that question about others, then we can rest in the calm of that question never having to be asked about us and not being able to be answered. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. This was a bit of a longer episode, but I hope it's given us a lot to think about and reflect on. I want to encourage you, keep on having these conversations. And if you found this valuable, tell other people about it. Share it on your social media. This is important stuff for us to be thinking about. So please send it out far and wide. Make sure you're following me on social media in the different places, and subscribe to the podcast. Leave a review. Tell others to come and listen. Thanks and goodbye.